In Book 2, the Trojan refugees have arrived at Carthage and are the guests of Queen Dido and her court. At her request, Aeneas recounts the story of the fall of Troy, an important event in the tradition which is not portrayed in either of the Homeric poems. Aeneas's moving account of the last day of Troy gives the audience insight into the nature of his character as a hero. Aeneas tells the story of the Trojan horse that the Greeks left behind when they abandoned their camp. The Trojans come up and marvel at it, wondering what to make of it. The priest of Neptune, Laocoon, violently urges the Trojans to caution. After the many years of war, he's wary of the Greeks' tricks and cannot bring himself to believe that the Greeks would simply abandon their siege of the town and sail home. He throws a spear at the horse, but does not manage to convince the people that it presents a serious threat. Later, two serpents come out of the sea and attack his sons, and when Laocoon rushes to try to save them, they are all killed by the sea monsters. This is taken as a sign of divine punishment against Laocoon for having hurled the spear at the horse. This then opens the way for the Trojans to bring the horse into the city, thus spelling the doom of Troy. The image of Laocoon is known from the famous ancient sculpture of him and his sons that is found today in the Vatican museums in Rome. This sculpture was further the inspiration for the work on aesthetics entitled Laocoon by the German Enlightenment philosopher Lessing. By returning to the Homeric world, Virgil is able to revisit some of the old characters and motifs that his audience was familiar with, but from a slightly different perspective. One of the old favorites is that of Odysseus, who is referred to here as Ulysses. As we have seen from the Odyssey, Odysseus was a great hero known for his intelligence and cunning. In the Odyssey, the audience follows him in his travels and trembles with him as he fights to restore his proper place in Ithaca. Now, in the Aeneid, Virgil gives us a rather different picture of the Greek hero. Instead of being a positive and sympathetic figure, Ulysses is portrayed as a sneaky, underhanded person. In Laocoon's plea to his fellow Trojans to be wary of the great wooden horse, he says, quote, "Do you imagine Greeks ever give gifts without some devious purpose? Is this all you know about Ulysses?" This negative picture of Odysseus culminates in Dante, who reserves a special place among the sinners in hell for him. This shift in the assessment of the character of Odysseus reflects a shift in the understanding of the status of human knowledge. Originally, Odysseus is praised for his cleverness in creating the ruse of the Trojan horse, which ultimately decides the fate of the war. But then, the same act takes on a negative shade and is regarded as something morally devious. Another scoundrel in the story is the Greek Sinon, whom the Trojans find having been left behind by his comrades. All a part of the ruse, Sinon tells the Trojans a lying story in order to induce them to let down their guard and bring the horse into their city. With the horse inside, he's then able to open the secret compartment and allow his Greek comrades to come out and begin the attack. When the Trojans first find Sinon, they tie his hands and treat him hostilely as a prisoner. But then, when he begins to speak, Aeneas recounts, quote, "We had a change of heart, and all of our passions were checked." After hearing his lying story, the Trojans, quote, "spared him and even began to pity him." Here we can see the old motif of pity being regarded not as a virtue, but as a great vice in the cause of suffering, as we saw earlier in Sophocles and Thucydides. If the Trojans had not pitied Sinon and not believed his story, they would have been suspicious of the Trojan horse and never allowed it into their city. Instead, their pity cost them their lives. One of the key elements in Book 2 is the depiction of Aeneas as rescuing the national and familial divinities from the onslaught of the Greeks. He's then able to bring these with him on his journey and instate them as the religion of the new community that he wishes to found. Thus, Virgil is trying to establish the antiquity and sacredness of the Roman religion by tracing it back to that of Troy. The gods were conceived as protectors of the city, and they were thought to live in the temples, which were located in the highest places. For the Romans, their most sacred statues and images of the gods were guarded by the priests in a long, unbroken tradition. Thus, when Aeneas describes the attack of the Greeks on the temples of Troy, this is an act of great sacrilege. Similarly, each Roman family worshipped its own deities, the Lares and the Penates, that were specific to their family tradition. The images of these deities and the sacred things from the Temple of Troy are what Aeneas is portrayed as rescuing and taking with him. When Aeneas is first warned of the fall of Troy by the ghost of the hero Hector, he's told that the city has entrusted, quote, her sacraments and her household gods to him. It's his mission to save them and continue their traditions elsewhere. He receives the statues and images of these deities from the priest Pantheus, who is fleeing the besieged citadel of Troy. In the end, Aeneas' father Anchises is told to take the, quote, sacraments and the ancestral gods of Troy, since it would be sacrilegious for Aeneas to touch them with blood on his hands. Aeneas then carries his father on his shoulders out of the burning city, thus symbolizing that he is the bearer of the future tradition of Rome.